Welcome to the second installment of our series of fireside chats called View from the Far Side. Today, it's my great pleasure to invite Brian Muraresku to this conversation. He, as many of you may know, is the author of the Immortality Key, this incredible book, which reflects about a decade or more of serious scholarship. The Immortality Key, the secret history of the religion with no name. And this book came out last year sometime, I believe, and has attracted a lot of attention, some denunciation from some quarters, but a remarkable reception in some of the more open-minded parts of the church and the religious establishment, as well, of course, as the psychedelic community, which sees it as a confirmation in some ways of what they've long suspected. So we're going to unpack some of the ideas in this book, and Brian, welcome. Thank you for coming.
Oh, thanks for having me, Dennis. I gotta say, I'm a gigantic fan of your decades worth of work, and it's largely the reason I have the honor of speaking with you today. You inspired me to go down this rabbit hole, so I'm happy to see you down here with me.
Well, thank you. You represent the kind of the younger generation after me that's carrying the torch, that's carrying on this type of serious scholarship. Your biography says that you have a degree in classics from Brown University with a degree in Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit. And you're also a lawyer, a graduate of Georgetown Law. It's not necessarily a justified inference, but you obtained this degree in classic studies, many of these obscure languages. I should mention perhaps, although it's somewhat relevant, but back in the day when I was a young man, I wanted to major in classics. And
I never knew that.
I had a dream about, a dream in terms of how I visualized my career, that I would go to Trinity College in Dublin and study classics. And in my first semester at the University of Colorado, I was serious enough to take a semester's course in Greek. And that disabused me of all those ambitions. It was like trying to learn an alien language, and I just realized I wasn't up to the task. So then I went on to science and biochemistry and so on. But that was an early dream, was to go to Trinity College. So I resonate with you, and I congratulate you for having the courage to do this. I don't know if your parents would have preferred that you just gone on to be a lawyer and be successful that way and kind of not pursue this crazy obsession. But I think a lot of us are happy that you did. So
I'm happy too. I'm happy to be here. You're versed in several alien languages. Many of which I'm very jealous of, not least of which is ethnobotany. I mean, you sit around at least familiar with most Latin species most of the day, I'm sure. So
that's true.
We all caught up together.
Yeah, well, botanical Latin is a pretty simplified affair, and I'm used to that. And of course, you and I also have in common that we're both grew up Catholic, and I don't know what your role was, whether you were an altar boy. I mean, I guess you went to a Catholic school, which fortunately I never had the option to do, and I consider myself lucky for that. I grew up in a very small town, but I was an altar boy, so I was actually lived about 20 minutes from the church. So I was the guy that they woke up at 6 a.m. to go serve mass in the middle of the week, and that was my exposure to the priests. So there was always a few, usually one main guy and a couple of visiting priests, and some really very remarkable people. I remember a couple of priests that were sort of in rotation at my church, and they were Jesuits. and we could have really interesting discussions, because I was at that age where you're beginning to question the teachings of the church and so on. And, they were good debate partners. They didn't convince me, but we had some good discussions. And then there were other aspects of my associations with the church that weren't so positive. And I sort of fell away from the faith, but they say you never really, you're either a Catholic or a recovering Catholic. So I guess I'm in the latter category. And do you still practice your faith? Do you have?
Well, that raises a big question. According to whom? There are folks in Rome who might sympathize with my version of Catholicism. There are others who don't. I guess that's the whole point of this 1.2 billion large religion. I've had some great conversations with Jesuits, some Anglicans, Episcopalians in the wake of this book. Lots of really receptive conversations, like you alluded to. So I went to 13 years of Catholic school and had a largely positive experience. I can never wake up early enough to become an altar boy. So I failed the altar boy test, but I passed the Latin and Greek test. Yeah. Exactly. So I got the language part of it. I didn't get, all the incense and the funky robes. But I got lucky. And the Jesuits were the whole reason I went off to college. Actually, I went to this prep school. I got a scholarship to go to this Jesuit prep school where I started learning classics at 14, really. So by the time I was 18, there was a good 4 years there. And I went to Brown to study classics, and I have to thank the Jesuits for that. And, my experience was largely positive. They were always, prompting me to ask deeper questions and, what good is faith if it goes untested, and try and get to the roots of this religion and go on and just keep asking bigger and bigger questions. So I did. And the result is what you showed there.
Well, the result is certainly impressive. And yeah, you were lucky. I'm sure that it was a very intellectual, stimulating environment. There are, as we know, very intelligent people in the church, and mostly in the Jesuits. And my aunt actually was a nun. My whole family has been Catholic, but then Terence and I sort of rejected all that. Not before we learned that there was actually an index of forbidden books. That was about the time that we were beginning to have doubts. And when I found out about that, I went out and read as many of them as I could. But, at age 16, it was kind of heavy sledding for me. So you're not... So I guess you were interested, you got interested in this topic from the original book by Ruck and Hoffman and Wasson, The Road to Eleusis, and then you were impressed by that, and then you proceeded to dig much, much deeper than they ever were able to do. So what obsessed you? What drove you to look into this so much and risk opprobrium, essentially, from the religious establishment? I mean, there must be some quarters where you've been thoroughly denounced, but maybe not. I don't know.
Not excommunicated just yet, Dennis.
Not yet.
You'll be happy to know.
Okay.
Not yet. So we have that to look forward to. But right. in the meantime, I answer this question differently. I mean, in the past I've talked about this awakening I went through in 2007, 2008, when I was reading the early studies coming out of Hopkins around psilocybin, and the idea that psilocybin can create what seems to be very genuine mystical experiences. It's this one and only dose, in that case, for volunteers in these clinical settings, but it reminded me of some of the testimony from antiquity. And so this is what I've been talking about for the past few months, but I want to answer it differently for you, because after I read the Hopkins study, and after I read Daniel Pinchbeck's Breaking Open the Head, in his bibliography and throughout his books, I came across this figure named Terence McKenna, who I'd never heard of in my entire life. I was then 27 years old, didn't know anything about psychedelics, was apparently a total nerd, and the opposite of countercultural, spending too much time in law school and Wall Street. And here comes Terence McKenna into my life when I was 27. And what was the first one I read? Food of the Gods, I think. And then I realized that there was this new thing called YouTube. And on YouTube, I could track down different lectures that he delivered over the years. At that point, it was probably a good 10 years before that, 15 years before that. So I went to this music store and I bought a speaker that I brought home to my apartment in New York City. I was living in the Village at the time. And I got this speaker for one and only reason, and that was that so I could blast Terence's voice in my apartment. And I would play YouTube over this speaker and lay down on my floor and listen to the Irish bard tell me stories about stoned apes and psychedelic grapes and the Bronze Age and honey and all these things that had all these pieces had been there. You know, when you study classics, all these little pieces kind of started floating to the surface. Right. And Terence was a gigantic part of me helping to kind of synthesize all these different threads.
I see. That's right. You find these threads, and his talks, and particularly Food of the Gods, kind of gave it a focus. I mean, it supplied a background for all of these allusions to these different magical potions and that sort of thing. And the great premise of Food of the Gods is that we've essentially co-evolved with psilocybin mushrooms, and that our association with at least that one, maybe not the others, but that one may go deep into prehistory, may in fact be the catalyst that was kind of a co-evolutionary partner that helped us uncover or develop what we think of as the human imagination. And we're talking time spans of not hundreds of thousands, but potentially millions of years. So going back that far, we don't need to be constrained by facts, right? Because there are none. It's reasonable to speculate that hominids in these North African environments co-evolved with cattle, which we know were there from fossil evidence. And the third part of that partnership would have been mushrooms. If the cattle were there, then the hominids were there, and almost certainly the mushrooms were there. But and being curious, naturally, hominids would have interacted with these things. We've talked about doing another webinar on this topic. We've emailed about that, and we do want to do a mini symposium on the Stoned Ape Theory at some point in the near future. But I don't want to get off on that today too much, other than just ask your opinion. What do you think about the Stoned Ape Theory? Is this plausible, or is this just completely crazy speculation?
I don't think it's as crazy as Gordon Wasson and Albert Hofmann and Carl Ruck in 1978 claiming that the ancient Greeks used psychedelics to find God. In 1978, to their credit, that was awfully courageous at the height of the war on drugs. That's a crazy idea to release in 1978 in the absence of hard scientific data, which is largely how I've occupied the past 12 years of my life, is trying to gather some evidence and some probative material to test that theory one way or the other. And I think Terence's idea about stoned apes is ripe for some testing. As a matter of fact, part of me wants to rebrand it in all due deference to Terence, although this is terrible branding, something like the pharmaphilic hominid hypothesis, because I feel like a hypothesis by definition is observable and testable and repeatable and falsifiable. And in that era, that epoch of prehistory, we have so little data. But part of me is really obsessed with tracking down the kind of data to test really wild ideas like that. Because if psilocybin-containing mushrooms were a part of the dawn of consciousness itself in species that preceded our own, that's the kind of thing that scientists should be looking into, I think. Paleoanthropologists that we talked about offline, and we can talk about more in the future. But I think this is the kind of thing that is ripe for testing at the highest levels of the academy.
Yes, I agree. And you went after this in a true scientific spirit. You went after it. For some reason, you listened to way too much Terence McKenna, and it refocused your interest on these substances. But you yourself are not a partaker. You have not, so you claim. I will accept that for the moment. That you actually have deliberately you didn't want to be marked as some crazy druggie who's just pushing this idea. You wanted the ideas to be evaluated on their own merits, and not on your merits or not on your qualifications. And your qualifications are that, you know, you were a serious scholar, you were interested in this, and you did the research. So in the process of doing that, you you developed your own qualifications. You are now among the experts that people can talk about this. And you know, the question of how you verify use of mushrooms at the 2 million year level is, I think, another conversation, because I don't know how you do it. I mean, I don't, but that's a question. If some way the existence of mushrooms in that environment where this process was going on could be verified, then you might be able to make a case for it. But right now, what you focused on, just basically because of the limitations of looking back any further. But if I interpret what you're saying, if I could thumbnail sketch it in a certain way to what you're saying, is that these ancient mystery religions like Eleusis, like the Dionysian mystery religions, which are in some ways more recent instantiations, they find their origin in these death cults at Göbekli Tepe, right? So they are, and that's 13,000 years, you know. So in terms of evolutionary time, that was yesterday. But in terms of historical times, that was a hell of a long time ago, you know. And what I take away from your writing is that, you know, these cults had their origins in these death cults, and it was in these environments, it was all about experimentation. You know, it was what shamans have always done. You know, they muck around with plants, you know, and they try different things. And in some sense, what shamans do is very scientific. You know, I mean, it's driven by curiosity, and it's like, and there was this very active fermentation culture around making beers, and just like craft brewers today might grab whatever's off the shelf and add it into the fermentation run and see what happens. That's effectively what was happening, and that went on for thousands of years. Is that an accurate way to view this, or?
That's what it seems like. And, you know, I artificially start my book at Göbekli Tepe about 13,000 years ago, again, largely because of Terence's scholarship. There's one page in the Food of the Gods I can never forget. And, you know, for those watching this who are familiar with his theories about this older matrilineal mushroom loving civilization that was supplanted by the subsequent patriarchal alcohol imbibing, bit more violent civilization. This is what he sketches in the Food of the Gods. But there's one page where he talks about potions, like beer and wine, for example, potentially being the midway or the vehicles for the reservoirs of this ancient biotechnology. And that always stuck in my mind for some reason, because when I think of antiquity, I don't necessarily think about, you know, like smoking, or I don't think about snuffing, at least in the ancient Mediterranean. What I think about is beer and wine. I think about potions. When you read Latin and Greek, you're reading a lot about wine, first of all, beginning in Homer, the very origin of Western civilization's literature, and, you know, carrying through to the Roman period. And in the Greeks, you know, you're also reading a lot about wine in the classical period, you know, from Plato and the Symposium onwards. You're always reading about wine, and to a lesser extent beer, at least in some of that literature. But I know that pops up as well in the biblical period and long before that. And so I was always intrigued by this idea of beer and wine being the vehicles for this older tradition that could very well go back, if not tens or hundreds of thousands of years, maybe even before our species. And so I was trying to find evidence of the oldest beer, and that took me to Göbekli Tepe, where it seems some experimentation was happening.
Yeah, and you have the archaeological evidence to identify the biomarkers in vessels recovered from there. Well, that's interesting that you point that out, because like snuffing and smoking, these are kind of new world things. And
exactly.
And, you know, South America, there's evidence for hallucinogenic snuffs that go back 10,000 years. No, with something like ayahuasca, it's very, very hard to document how ancient it is. And I suspect it's not that old, but the snuffs from Tiwanaku and other sites are pretty well documented. Whereas in the New World, it's not a smoking, snuffing culture, it's a drinking culture. So the fermentation products became this, almost in terms of alchemy, fermentation became this vessel in which they could toss, my impression is, anything that came to hand, that might be interesting. I mean, I think there was what I infer is that there was not a singular focus on particular ingredients, that sometimes it might have been ergot, sometimes it might have been nightshades and other types of things, which would have produced an array of different beverages with kind of a spectrum of psychoactivities, not necessarily psychedelic in some ways, but inevitably with all this experimentation, they're going to hit on a formula that delivers the goods, in the way that psilocybin delivers the goods, reliably can elicit these profound mystical and visionary experiences, which, you won't get from nightshades. You'll get other things from nightshades, and they may be relevant, but and so, an ergot may be the major psychedelic ingredient that they were using. Although, I mean, here's my bone to pick with you, Brian, if I have one. It is that ergot may deliver a psychedelic experience, but it's also toxic, and it may not produce the kind of transcendent experience that clearly from Eleusis and the other writings people were experiencing. The one psychedelic that we know of that might have been accessible, that required no processing, very little pharmacological knowledge, is mushrooms. But you hardly talk about mushrooms. And I'm wondering, is that just because there is no evidence for it, or what? Whereas, I mean, your evidence is based on these chemical analyses of these different vessels, which is
right.
Brilliant. That's a definitive test, but it leaves a lot of questions unanswered.
It does. It's the state of the data today does not point to things like psilocybin containing mushrooms or the Amanita muscaria, although Carl Ruck himself, the co-author on that 1978 book, does openly talk about the Amanita and is a fan of that as a potential candidate in the mysteries. I focused on ergot because that seems to be Albert's idea. Ergot is the naturally occurring fungus from which he was able to synthesize LSD.
Right.
Potentially other alkaloids, but my short answer is I agree with you. I went out there looking for DMT. I went out looking for psilocybin containing mushrooms and the Amanita and couldn't find it in the archaeobotanical and archaeochemical literature as it exists today, which essentially means nothing. That's like me opining on the Stoned Ape Theory when I don't even think we have the technology to properly test that. We're working on it, and I'm really optimistic that we're going to turn up some interesting studies. But the way the journals exist today, what I was able to track down, which corresponded to that 1978 theory, was this miniature chalice from Iberia, 2nd century BC, that did test positive for the microscopic traces of ergot, kind of like an ergotized beer, exactly as they hypothesized, which, and I think the only reason that survived, that ergot survived, is because it was the sclerotia, so the hardened shell. Which, I mean, even that I think is a minor miracle that survived for 2,200 years in this miniature chalice and was able to be detected under optical microscopy. Mushrooms they disappear, like most organic matter. It's really hard with present technology to find them, but I'm confident that with new technology, we may be able to tease out some of the alkaloids that were present in some of these mushrooms.
Right. Well, the only mushroom structures that might last that long would be spores, and
Exactly.
spores are incredibly hard, and they would be able to survive it. But even if you found spores in some of these excavations, could identify them as Psilocybe cubensis, that doesn't necessarily show that it's going into their sacramental preparations, because spores are around, and they could find it. But yeah, it's and also I think you've touched on an interesting conundrum in my estimation in the history of ethnopharmacology, ethnobotany. There seems to be as in the Road to Eleusis, they talk, and Carl Ruck talks about Amanita muscaria as maybe one of the sacramental mushrooms that were used. Certainly, they were used, and we know that they had a long history in Siberian shamanism, which is probably where they came from. The road to, they may have been using Amanita at Eleusis or other states. As an ethnopharmacologist, though, I have a problem with Amanita, which is, again, it doesn't deliver the goods. It's not a true psychedelic. It is profoundly psychoactive, but the chemistry is all wrong, and the pharmacology is all wrong. The same is true of the nightshades. Definitely, they were preparing beers and wines, probably with henbane and these sorts of things added to it. But that's a whole different pharmacology. That's they're anticholinergic rather than serotonergic, and they do produce profoundly altered states. And I think the phenomenology of the nightshade experience, I haven't worked with. I mistakenly ate about 4 datura pods when I was 16, so I got the full spectrum of activities, and I never touched it after that because it was horrifying. Wow. And very difficult. But what was interesting about it is when you look at some of these traditions, I think the idea of ghosts and wraiths and these kinds of entities, because when you take the tropanes from the nightshade, that's what happens. I sometimes say in my lectures, I've said, nightshades are true hallucinogens, but not true psychedelics. And by that I mean you have hallucinations that you cannot distinguish from reality on nightshades. And so very often people appear in your trance, in the experience, and you have long conversations with these entities, which appear as solid as somebody sitting across the table from you. And then they just sort of fade away. They just go up in smoke, which when I took it, that made me extremely anxious and fearful because these entities were appearing to me and I was asking for help. Get me out of here. And they would just look at me and sort of, you pathetic idiot, and sort of shake their head and then disappear. But the thing is, I guess the point of that is the hallucinations on nightshades are as real, you cannot distinguish them from reality. In the case of psychedelics, you may have hallucinations. I would say it's more accurate to call them visions because they often happen behind the eyes. But you generally know that these are visions, that these hallucinations that you see are not part of reality. I mean, certain situations, that's not true, but in general, you know that you're in an altered state. You understand that you've taken a drug and that the effects are going to go away sooner or later. You get no such assurance with the nightshade. So I think in some ways, if these traditions that involve spirits and the seeing of spirits in the wilderness, I guarantee you, if you go into the forest and you take datura, you're going to be swamped by spirits.
Wow.
That's what happens. And I'm not recommending it, but that's the phenomenology of it.
I'm gonna blame you, Dennis, when I find myself in the middle of a forest being chased by wraiths.
Well, just don't take the nightshade. Stick with the true psychedelics, and the true psychedelics are these things like psilocybin mushrooms and the other, what we call the classic psychedelics, LSD, DMT, mescaline. All of these things work on a particular set of serotonin receptors, the so-called serotonin 2A or 5-HT2A receptors. And that neural system seems to be the system that mediates these kinds of transcendent mystical experiences. So my question is, why?
Yeah. As we're talking in real time, this is the first I'm going to voice this now, Dennis.
Okay.
I've come more and more now, and talking to you now kind of helps confirm it, that I'm not sure, at least I have doubt, I'm not sure, despite this miniature chalice in which we turned up the microscopic evidence for what seems like some kind of ergotized beer, more or less contemporaneous with the classical mysteries, its relation to the mother temple back home in Eleusis, we just don't know. And we just don't know what that potion was, how it may have changed over the 2,000 years Eleusis seems to have been in existence, calling to initiates for century after century. But the more I think about it, I'm wondering if it was less a classical psychedelic experience and more a visionary event or a hallucinogenic event. If ergot was somehow involved, and if it wasn't LSD, maybe it was LSA or LSH, one of these other ergolines. We haven't reproduced it in the laboratory, so frankly, we don't know. As you mentioned, I have my doubts about ergot too, but when you read the very little testimony that does survive from antiquity, there's some interesting details in there about this mimicked journey through the underworld, right? Because this initiate went into the temple at Eleusis, dedicated to Demeter and her daughter Persephone, who is abducted to the underworld, makes this miraculous resurrection through the course of this all-night affair that you witnessed once and only once in your life. But it's sometimes described as like a terrifying event. You were participating in that underworld journey. There's notions of sweating, I think, at least in the Latin. I'm beginning to think more and more that maybe it wasn't like a macro heroic dose, as your brother would put it. And maybe it was a lower level, if it was ergot, some kind of hallucinogenic, but not properly full-blown psychedelic event where at least you're there spying things and witnessing things. Maybe not with the mind's eye, but maybe you actually felt it was there. Like there's also descriptions of phasmata, like ghostly apparitions that fill the temple at some point, which is awfully strange. It seems almost more like a solanaceous plant, like those anticholinergic effects that you were talking about.
Well, there's no reason why, true psychedelics and solanaceous plants couldn't have been combined. There's this whole spectrum of phytochemistry that potentially they could have drawn from. For example, in South America, it's not uncommon that ayahuasca preparations will contain admixtures from Brugmansia, which is the South American tree daturas. And obviously that's going to change the nature of the experience. So maybe it is that these, maybe the medicine was just a part of it, and the rest, and it was highly dependent on what else was going on, the music, the ritual, the other visual inputs, just like any modern psychedelic experience or mystical experience. It's, they go on about the set and setting, which we know is very important to, as a vessel, essentially, in which the psychedelic experience can unfold. And the people that were running the mystery religions had to be aware of this. And so it was as much performance as it was a drug experience. But whatever it was, the people who went, it had to have an impact, because this was like a once in a lifetime experience and it changed them forever. At least that was the expectation. And what we know from modern pharmacological studies and clinical studies of psilocybin is it is one of these medicines that can reliably induce these changes, which are long lasting, changes in attitude, mood, positivity, all of these parameters that, it really engineers your worldview. You know, I mean, a night or two with psilocybin can be transformative forever. And it's like the Eleusinian Mysteries are similar to that. They were not something you did every weekend. They were something you did at most a few times in a lifetime, usually once or twice. So they had to have an impact. I want to, before I forget it, I'd like to share my screen for a minute, if I could.
Sure.
You can see this, and this is on the cover of your book, right? Some version of this.
Yes.
And you know, as a non-archaeologist, non-Greek scholar, but a botanist and sort of mycologist, this looks a lot like a mushroom. but I have been told by people that know it's definitely a flower.
Right.
What do you think about this image? I mean, this is kind of the iconic representation of Eleusis, right? Even though this is not from Eleusis, but from a Eleusinian temple.
Right. This is from Pharsalos in what we call Thessaly. So within Greece, and it had some Eleusinian connections. It's the ultimate mystery Rorschach test. You know, Dennis sees one thing, Brian sees another, Carl Ruck sees a third. And sometimes, you know, we'll even change our minds depending on which week you catch us.
Right.
I think there was an older classicist, it could be close to 100 years ago, who actually tried to identify that as a fungal shape. I mean, it's hard not to see some kind of fungal shape there. And you see the stipe being held. It's quite a thick stipe there. It doesn't seem like a flower stem to me. That's been identified as a rose or some other unidentified species of flower by other classicists, art historians. My favorite theory is knuckle bones from sacrificed animals that were used in different games in antiquity. Today, I kind of see a mushroom. Tomorrow, I might disagree, but you know, I put it on the cover of the book as a send up, really, to the 30th anniversary edition of The Road to Eleusis that Robert Forte edited, which is how I got involved in these mysteries. And you know, I know Carl's a big fan of this image. I wonder what people think. We should get some. We should do a survey and just see where it lands and make that the data.
Well, yes and no. I mean, we could do a survey. I suspect, depending on, you know, what demographic slice you surveyed, you get somewhere between 0% and 100% saying that it was a mushroom. But, you know, I mean, that's an interesting suggestion. It's an idea to, you know, evaluate how people might look at it. But it is not really evidence one way or the other. It's just, this is the contemporary view. So what do you make of things like that?
It's hard to tell. I mean, I don't know many plants that flower like that. It could be, I mean, it's hard, again, it's hard not to see a fungal pattern there, but that could also be, you know, an umbellifer. Father Francis, when we're touring the catacombs under Rome, when I ask him about different fungal objects, will often come up with some species I've never seen before. There's so many images like that pop up in medieval psalters and cathedrals. This one, I think my friend Jerry Brown has written about in the Psychedelic Gospels. Really, really compelling stuff. What do you see there?
I don't know. I don't know what to see. Whether these are, I mean, I've read that sometimes these fungal images, especially when they appear to be the big scale, they're basically stylized trees. There's a certain tradition of depicting trees as these kind of fungoid. So what is interesting to you about this? Other than the obvious, but
well,
what does this mean?
The first thing I see is an anthropomorphism. I see whatever floral or fungal arrangement is below the savior there, with a nice Orthodox Greek cross behind him. I see them making the same image as the savior. So I think that the main idea there is that divinity is present within the natural realm. You see the natural kingdom kind of resonating with this invisible figure above it, in this great symmetry. Now, I don't know. I've never seen anything that grows like that in nature. I mean, there's kind of an Amanita flair to the one on the right, obviously, with the red and speckled white. I've never seen. I mean, have you seen any mushrooms that look like that?
Well, you could get Amanita out of that, because it is so distinctive. But the one on the left, you could almost get Psilocybe cubensis out of that. I mean, it's the right color, the way that the mushroom grows, usually with little ones around it. That's very characteristic of the way that Psilocybe mushrooms grow. So that image that we were just discussing is part of this one.
Right. See, that's, again, really hard to, it's hard not to see the fungal image. I mean, down below in the Garden of Paradise there.
Right.
That in particular, and this is from the same, I think it's the first folio in the Psalter, by the way, which is even more interesting. So you see a depiction of Genesis there. And you see that those stylized trees that, again, kind of have this fungal arrangement about them. I've never seen trees grow like that. Or I've also never seen mushrooms the height of humanoid Adam and Eve.
Right, but there are two panels here that seem to depict mushrooms, at least two. That one, this one that we were just talking. No, I guess that is the same one. Anyway, what does Jerry Brown make of? Well, of course, he insists that they're mushrooms. But do you? What's your view of his work on this psychedelic gospel? Here's another.
I mean, I'm not sure I agree with some of the imagery. I mean, it's the theory would be that there were those within the faith, within the tradition, who somehow carried this along from antiquity to the Middle Ages and beyond. I mean, that as an idea, I think is plausible. I mean, I follow the same lead, by the way. And so, we have some cryptic references in the literature. We have better references in the literature talking about the actual pharmacology from antiquity. So I focus on Dioscorides, for example, and his Materia Medica in the 1st century. I mean, there's pretty unambiguous descriptions of spiking wine with different plants and herbs, including several solanaceous plants, like we were just talking about, these deliriants, which I never would have expected to find in the 1st century AD at the same moment that the Gospels themselves are being written. So we can't say that the earliest Christians had no idea about some of these traditions. There was a really sophisticated pharmacology, including after Dioscorides into Galen, for example, whose works remain untranslated to English, 22 volumes, thousands and thousands of pages, untranslated to English, from the personal physician to Marcus Aurelius, essentially. So we know there was very sophisticated pharmacology. I think the question is, what became of that? And where did that go? And why was it suppressed, if it was suppressed? How did this disappear? How do we know so much about classical psychedelics from the New World and so little from the Old World? I think that's where Jerry and I would probably agree, that there was something there in antiquity, it disappears, and how was it retained? I think a lot of it was probably through folk medicine. And I read a lot about the witches and all these underground movements that probably kept this alive. Now, could some of that had made its way into these monastic communities and into these illuminated manuscripts and this wonderful artworks in the cathedrals? Of course. But I think it's more constructive to talk about the scientific data and some of this archaeobotany and archaeochemistry. And I think the more we look there, the more evidence we're going to tease out to try and put this story together, which is not to dismiss those images. I mean, they're weird, they're peculiar. But I think ultimately we're probably just speculating, though.
Yeah, it's well, it's a good place to be because in a sense there are just enough facts or just enough odd items here to then just let speculation run wild. And I think your efforts to actually find hard chemical archaeobotanical data is admirable, but maybe doomed in the end, because you're going to find the markers in the vessels that something was fermented here, some brew was fermented, but beyond that, it's hard to infer what else might have been in there. Most of these alkaloids are not that stable over thousands of years. So you're kind of left looking for, well, in the case of ergot, for example, the structures that can last that long and show up. So and then right, these ancient mystery traditions, like in Eleusis and Dionysus, then what you're saying is that there wasn't a split, that essentially the Eucharist in the early centuries AD emerged from these same traditions. They really weren't separate. Is that accurate to say? Is that how you understand it?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, and just take the basic premise that the New Testament is drafted in Greek, as far as we're aware. The Gospels and Paul's letters, roughly half the New Testament, is written in Greek to Greek speakers. And though Christianity is born in the Holy Land, but it takes root and pops up and develops in all these Greek-speaking communities, like Corinth, for example. Paul writes a letter to the Corinthians, which is not that far west of Eleusis. The same sacred institution that survived for 2,000 years. I mean, I don't think it's reasonable to suggest that the early Christian community at Corinth never heard of Eleusis. I think the question is, what was their relationship to those who'd been initiated? I mean, did they have a parent? Did they have a brother or a sister, even a child who'd been to Eleusis and told stories about this rapturous event, this beatific vision? However it was engineered, whether it was an ergotized beer or some kind of solanaceous beer or the Amanita or none of the above or all of the above. What are the odds that somebody in Corinth never heard about that tradition or never heard about the Oracle of Delphi just to its north, where it's claimed that the Pythia, this prophetess, was inhaling these vapors and thereby having these oracular visions. So that Christianity is born at a time when there's lots of magic and mysticism, and I would argue there was a really sophisticated pharmacology. And so the only question is, how did those worlds meet into this Eucharist, which I think at least some of the early Greek-speaking Christian communities would have interpreted as some kind of vestige of the very pagan, very Greek mysteries that had been around for generations and generations.
So then if the early Christian traditions did incorporate these pagan practices, and your intuition on this seems exactly right, because if you look at other situations in the New World, for example, the way that, for example, ayahuasca is used by numerous different tribes. Nobody can really say who originated it, but once that discovery was made, it diffused, into many tribes in the New World, and now there are dozens of tribes that used ayahuasca. You can't point to the one that invented it. They'll all claim they invented it because it's all tied in with creation myths and this sort of thing. But I think that's probably right. There was a period of, I guess the term is syncretic sharing of these traditions, but also it had a very practical aspect because these people were experimentalists. They were experimental ethnopharmacologists, just like we have those today. And the witches were, they carried on that tradition. They may have adapted some of these traditions, but then they became the herbalists. They became the people that understood how to use plants to heal. And particularly, they had to know about the properties of ergot I don't know what the exact period would be, but they understood that ergot could be used to induce labor, to induce abortions, but also to treat postpartum hemorrhaging, the very kinds of things that ergot's used for today. The witches had this knowledge, and because the knowledge was about the most sacred thing, the most mysterious thing, about human biology, which is reproduction, which is sort of the province of women, obviously, and so the church reacted against that, essentially. As my impression from your book is that there was a big backlash at some point and a need to suppress this feminine wisdom, and before that, women were the priests. After that, that was part of the suppression, the fact that women were vilified and severely persecuted for participating in practices that at an earlier date, they were the keepers of the tradition. They were the priestesses. So
That's right.
what is it about that? Why was this so vehemently rejected? Was it an attempt on the institutional, as the church became institutionalized, there was an interest in separating themselves from these early traditions, whether women centered or not. It's just
Right.
basically an impulse to say, we're not these wild-eyed, hippies taking all these weird things. We're the pure church, and so all the pharmacological component was denied essentially.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's. I didn't know what I was going to find when I went down this rabbit hole, but what I found it, time and again, as you reference, is that the women became the herbalists, became the witches at some point in history, and they were the priestesses of antiquity, largely for the same reason. Go back to Circe, the original witch
Right.
of Homeric literature. Again, 8th, 7th century BC. Circe, if anything, is known for her expertise over the pharmaca lugra, as Homer says it, the baneful drugs that she mixes into these potions. In fact, Homer uses that word kukion, the mixed potion, the same mixed potion that found its way into the Eleusinian Mysteries, which had its priestesses and originally was a rite of women's initiation exclusively for women. Only later were men involved. Same as the Mysteries of Dionysus, largely female-led orgies and gatherings in the woods of women prancing around naked with leopard skins and fawn skins and things of that nature. As Euripides very colorfully puts together in the Bacchae. I mean, these were rites of female, orgiastic, ecstatic madness. There's no way around that. And I think some of that did seep its way into early Christianity. I spent a lot of time in the Roman catacombs looking at frescoes of women consecrating what looks to be a Eucharistic kind of ceremony. I mean, the Vatican itself, in the little pamphlets it makes about these catacombs, even calls some of these proto-Eucharistic ceremonies exactly that the Eucharistic ceremonies par excellence, they say in Italian. So it's clear that women were involved in this tradition. And by getting rid of them, I think you also do get rid of that pharmacology. And so, maybe you're right. Maybe part of the backlash against these heretical Gnostic Christian movements was a way for Christianity to distinguish itself from those pagan cult traditions where women had managed, where it wasn't easy, by the way, to get a foothold, because it was not fun to be a woman in ancient Greece or ancient Rome. It wasn't very fun. And yet they found these positions of leadership. And in the early church, when there weren't any brick and mortar basilicas, there weren't any physical churches, there were dining rooms and there were catacombs. And that's where the faith was born. Again, the province of women, right? In these domestic spheres where the person who was going to whip up a Eucharist, right? And serve the wine was probably a woman. And there are lots of women mentioned in the New Testament, by the way, as the carriers of this faith, especially in Rome, where I found some other archaeobotanical data. But I couldn't help but think that by getting rid of women, you're also getting rid of that tradition. And the big question is why, which I don't know. But historically, we know this all dies out in the 4th century, and there it goes underground.
Yeah, that's interesting. It was the impulse to suppress women. Women were the keepers of the pharmacopoeia. Essentially, they were the herbalists. They were the shamans, as well as the formulators of these things. But then, of course, the women also are, the keepers, the guardians of the secrets of reproduction, and how to control pregnancy, induce it, terminate it, all of these more or less taboo topics. And I'm wondering, was the church motivated to suppress the pharmacology, and it happened to be the province of the women, or were they more motivated to suppress the role of women in general, their biology in a certain way? I've often said that one of the aspects of the Catholic Church and Christianity in general is this denial of biology. Essentially, if it feels good, it must be bad. There's that sort of attitude, and so sex is in this very charged area as well, and women are perceived as the controllers of sexuality, and in a certain way they were. So by denying women's role in these traditions, they also managed to sort of co-opt sexuality and make that the province of the patriarchs, which were all about how you know how you could control sexuality. And of course the church is very squirrely about sex, as well as, Brian, it's all about sex and drugs and rock and roll, and it really is. If you think about it, it really is. I mean, sex is obviously central to our existence as biological entities, because that's what engenders future generations. Drugs are, I mean, this is my rant, but drugs are also in this category because we're made of drugs, and that's why drugs work. We're made of drugs. So the idea of deliberately altering consciousness is, taboo if you're, because it puts that capability, that power back in the individual, and the church doesn't want individuals to have power. They want institutions to have power, and then the rock and roll part of it, well, that's another, but we all know, for example, the role of sound in inducing altered states. So,
right.
And undoubtedly sound was part of the ancient traditions, as well as the church-centered traditions. Sound is an indispensable component to it. And in general, we respond to sound. We primates respond to sound in various ways because we're oscillating systems. Biology is inherently an oscillating proposition. Metabolism is oscillation. So rhythm and all of cycles and all that are literally built into our bodies and our neurophysiology. And all of these things, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, are things that the church doesn't want individuals to control. They want to call the shots. Why? Why is there that reaction or aversion, or I don't know what the term is, to biology? Is this just basically a way to grab power?
That's a big one. I wish I could answer that. That's a big one. I know that in antiquity, the church fathers had less than enlightened views on women, and actually blamed their biology, in some cases, for preventing them from having the kind of relationship that men could have with God. Using lots of discombobulated and rather embarrassing theological doctrine to support that. And so I often think of what Eliade says, that the history of religion is nothing less than the intersection of metaphysics and biology. We are biological beings, which is why I'm interested in psychedelics, and how it impacts sexuality, and the same way that sound and rhythm and music and dance does. Because when you look at like the mysteries of Dionysus, I don't just think about the mysteries of Dionysus, I hear them. We have all this imagery of the tympanum and the drums and the flutes. You see a similar procession on the way to Eleusis. These were raucous events. And when the Christianized Roman Empire, patriarchal, was trying to stamp out these mysteries in the 4th century, they started in fits and starts. It would eventually happen, but they started by trying to ban nocturnal celebrations. And what was happening? These were torch-lit ceremonies of music, laughter, and dance, essentially, right? These were the pagan mysteries. So what better way to get rid of the pagan mysteries than to suppress women, get rid of the rock and roll, and stamp out the drugs all the while? I mean, it's hard not to gravitate towards a simplistic retelling of the 4th century like that. So, I mean, I'm not sure how much of it is actually true, but it's part of the narrative. I mean, men took over the bureaucracy of the church, right? The Roman church stepped into the role of patriarchal Roman Empire. No female empresses in Rome that I know of, and it keeps moving, right? There's a reason the Pope and cardinals and bishops have all been male for the past 2,000 years. Again, it's not fun to be a woman at that time. So, how much of that was a conscientious attempt to suppress women and drugs and rock and roll? I don't know, but it certainly fits the narrative of what was happening in the 4th century AD.
Yeah, well, I mean, my biases, what I would like to these things, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, these are the engines of ecstasy. This is what drives ecstasy, and the kinds of conclaves, gatherings that you talk about had all of these elements, even probably sexuality in some cases. I mean, I don't know if they were orgies, but there might have been that kind of thing. It's not that different than what you might encounter in a, New Age retreat, although sexuality is kind of de-emphasized. But I think that the early church, fathers of the institutional church recognized these things are too powerful. These engines of ecstasy are too potent for mere lay people. We have to take control, because through that we can control the congregation and their beliefs and so on, and consolidate our power. So
it's Footloose. It was Footloose, Dennis. Have you seen the movie Footloose?
I haven't, no.
we should check it out sometime. It's I mean, the suppression of rock and roll. By the local church. I mean, maybe it's an old story that plays out time and again.
Well, right. Ever since then, the church has had this sort of squirrely attitude toward these things, these essential components of biological existence. It's like that's denial, that is denied. And I think one of my main criticisms of Christianity and the Catholic Church is that this leads to a temptation to devalue nature in a certain sense, and to devalue our own human nature, but also nature as a whole. The message being that you don't have to worry about this world. Nature exists to serve us, and your reward is in the next world. So it takes away the incentive to preserve this world in some way. So in the New World, when the Spanish began to penetrate the New World and encounter these other cultures that were still more ecstasy based, using psychedelics like psilocybin, it seems that, I guess it was a brutal time. I guess the perception was that if people did not accept the faith in these other cultures, then they weren't really human. And so then that was permission to utterly devastate these cultures and suppress these practices, which were on the surface of it blasphemous, in the perception of for example, the mushrooms were called teonanacatl in Mexico, the flesh of the gods. I'm sure that just enormously pissed off the missionaries that were contacting these cultures and saying, well, no, that's our brand. We can't, only one religion gets to call itself the religion of the flesh of God. So you guys are heretics.
That was patent infringement. That was 17th century patent infringement.
17th century patent infringement. Yes. And the big difference was that the indigenous sacraments actually delivered, and the other didn't do much, didn't do anything on the pharmacological level. So I think that's an interesting, sort of cognitive dissonance that built into the Christian perspective that, these people are subhuman and therefore not worthy of being treated as humans. So we can essentially implement genocide. And it's okay because we're not killing people. We're killing something that's less than human.
Well, demon worshippers and demon worshippers who were demonic, not least of which because of their relationship with some of these plants. At the very end of my book, I do reference one of these treatises, the treatise on the heathen superstitions by Hernando Ruiz de Alarcón, 1629. What does he go after? He goes after Olaluqui. He goes after tobacco and peyote. So, from the beginning of colonization, it was seen as a problem for the local missionaries, and a problem that persists for centuries, to the point where I also include this reference to a letter from the Bureau of Indian Affairs from the late 19th century, 1890, talking about how this same damn plant, in this case peyote, was, quote, interfering quite seriously with the work of the missionaries on the Native American reservations in the United States. And so, another huge problem, just this thorn constantly in the side of the church and what would become the US federal government, working in concert with the missionaries to continue stamping out these drugs. In fact, peyote, I think that ban on peyote from the federal government is among the first federal regulations prohibiting these kinds of drugs. Before opium, way before cannabis, before these other drugs are outlawed, it's peyote, and it's sacramental use by the Native Americans.
Yeah, and just like in the history of drug suppression, it was one of the earliest. But drug prohibition of various kinds of drugs has always been, essentially a bludgeon to direct at particular minorities. Mexican Americans, Hispanic Americans with cannabis, and cocaine to a certain extent with the Black community. Wars on drugs are always wars on people, right? It's not about the drugs. It's about the wars on the beliefs and the practices. And the church was, very active in that sense. But now we're at maybe we're at a juncture, and because I was fascinated by what came in the latter part of your book. So suddenly there's all of this data, scientifically supported data that, there is a substance that can reliably induce a mystical or cosmic experience. And if it's not genuine, whatever that means, it sure looks genuine. And I'm one of those people who say, if it looks like a duck and walks like a duck and talks like a duck, it's probably a duck, and whether it's chemically induced or not, that does not make it not real. That doesn't make it not valid. What it does on some level, you could say, well, if you're a believing Christian, you could say, well, God, was smart enough to evolve these primates with this built-in neural structure, these neural networks that are capable of having a transcendent experience. Now, what the evolutionary use of that might be, but we can speculate on that. But I think it's interesting that that's one way. And now, because of this accumulation of scientific data, the mystical experience, which used to be something that people would seek all their lives, and if they were lucky, they might get one. Well, now we basically dragged it into the laboratory. We can study it, we can dissect it, we can reliably induce it under the right circumstances. And remarkably, it seems that the church is maybe receptive to this now. I mean, there are, of course, within the church, a lot of smart Jesuits and other people who do have more open minds. So what you are suggesting is that maybe there's an opening here to the reintegration of psychedelics back into religious practices within the church. You think that's a possibility?
I think it's a possibility. Yeah, I mean, all kudos to Roland Griffiths and the team at Hopkins, and Tony Bossis and the team at NYU, and Charlie Grove. I'm sure you know all these guys who for decades have been doing the hard clinical work to try and make heads or tails of this psychedelic experience, particularly with psilocybin, which does seem to induce quite reliably, quite potently, these mystical or mystical-like experiences. What does that mean? And what does it mean for the healthy normals is a question I keep asking. I mean, there are folks who certainly can benefit from these substances for any number of clinical conditions, right? Anxiety, depression, and end-of-life distress, those suffering from cancer, addiction, PTSD. There's a really long list for what these drugs could be doing for people under FDA approval. But there's a whole other class of people out there, the healthy normals who have these, existential longings, these ontological longings, this yearning for meaning. And it seems that under the right conditions, something like psilocybin, for example, could actually help someone like that. And rather than going into a clinical setting or, an FDA approved licensed center and somewhere across the country, why not a monastery?
Right. Yeah. I think that's what's exciting now about now that psychedelics are being accepted, they're not stigmatized so much. So now we're in search of the right paradigm. A sterile clinical setting is not the optimal setting. I mean, for FDA reasons and other reasons, that is what you have to do. But I'm very encouraged that, there's widespread recognition that you do have to create an appropriate set and setting. And that may look like a shamanic ceremony. It may look like even a religious ceremony, but the recognition that there needs to be a vessel for these experiences to happen. And so that, is essential to having these really extremely powerful, really profoundly meaningful experiences. That's necessary. And it was something that the ancient mystery religions understood very well. It wasn't just the drug, it was the context in which the drug was taken. Now the church maybe can come back and say, well, maybe so. The fact that this experience can be elicited by a specific pharmacological response does not necessarily devalue it. That doesn't mean that it's not a genuine experience. I mean, if you look at it, every experience that we have is mediated by neurochemistry, but we don't go around saying every experience I have is not genuine. I mean, maybe it isn't, but we'd like to believe that it was. So toward the end of the book, you show that you would like to be sort of at the forefront of seeing the church beginning to accept these practices and even integrating them. I mean, what you really want to do, Brian, is you want to take psilocybin with the Pope, right?
Who wouldn't, Dennis? Who wouldn't want to do that?
Even I would sign up for that.
That's what I'm talking about. I mean, I think it's something to look forward to. And it's not total speculation, because I can point to like the Santo Daime, which I'm sure you know well, or the UDV. I mean, there are branches of syncretic Christianity that already avail themselves of these very powerful substances. And in those cases, ayahuasca, obviously, or peyote in the Native American church. Why not psilocybin in the hands of a really conscientious, well-trained minister, pastor, priest, nun, monk? Thomas Merton, whose work I love, was corresponding on this very topic with Aldous Huxley in the late 1950s. And as far as I can tell, Thomas Merton's main preoccupation was the idea of this becoming habituated, with which I agree. I don't think this is the kind of practice you do every Sunday. This has nothing to do with replacing the Sunday Eucharist or the traditional liturgy. I think whether it's Catholicism or Orthodox or any of the Protestant denominations or even evangelical Christianity, this is the kind of thing that is like extra credit. If you're even thinking about psychedelics, you're probably into some esoteric, inner work leaning, introspective leaning aspects of the faith, the mystical aspects of the faith that you can find in any branch of Christianity. And it's been there for a very long time, especially in these religious orders. So if there's to be a sacred container for holding this, for some reason, I keep thinking about these abbeys and these monasteries dotted all over the planet, many in the United States, where, again, if properly trained and under the right circumstances, maybe once or twice in your life, you could make a very sacred pilgrimage to one of these places and be in the hands of a very qualified religious professional. I mean, someone who dedicates their life to emotional breakthroughs and existential questions and sitting with people as they're dying. I mean, that's hard work. Therapists can do it. I know a lot of clergy who can do it too.
Like you say, extra credit outside the general practice of going to Mass every Sunday and being a good Dogen. These are different. But I think if you could get that going, and there is bound to be a lot of pushback against that. But if the church could accept that, I think that would make the church more acceptable to a lot of people. Everybody is seeking meaningful experience. You don't have to be mentally ill. You don't have to be, everyone wants mystical, meaningful experience. Roland does not use the word mystical. He talks about personally meaningful experience.
Right.
Who of us doesn't long for that and feel that there is a deficit of that in our day-to-day experience? So the church could be a profound influence for healing because of what you say. There are like 1.2 billion people that are basically under the sway of the of the Catholic Church. So the potential for healing is tremendous, and our world needs healing very much. And I've often said the psychedelics are medicines for the human soul, as well as for individuals. And the potential for healing in that context is tremendous. And that might give the Catholic Church essentially a path to redemption, a path to make up for all the terrible things they've done in the past as far as suppressing all of these practices, from the earliest mystery religions to the Holocaust of the New World, which is basically, you can lay much of that to the church and the Inquisition. But maybe this is a path to redemption for the church that you can, but they will have to they'll have to come to a, they'll have to relinquish the reins of power. They'll have to basically say, okay, up to now, the churches, the priests have been in control of these experiences. We don't acknowledge that the congregation is qualified to have this. They don't have the right to this. So it requires a huge attitude shift to be able to say, well, yes, under the right circumstances, people can have these meaningful experiences with the divine and the transcendent. And that's not a threat to the power of the priesthood. In some ways, it's an affirmation to the power of the priesthood if it has the wisdom to recognize that.
Wow, is this the brand of Christianity that could call to a lapsed Catholic like Dennis McKenna to put back on those altar boy robes?
I don't know if I'm going to go that far, but I would certainly show up if you get the Pope involved. Yeah, I would show up for that one for sure. And I would leave my reservations at the door and just participate. So yes, boy, we could talk for a lot more time. I keep getting text messages that we're coming up on an hour and a half. I wanted to mention the Academy, which in some ways was founded in the spirit of Eleusis and in the spirit. And other than that, has very little to do with Eleusis, other than the idea that Eleusis was a place where one could come and learn about these mysteries and ultimately the mystery of being. So we call the Mckenna Academy a modern mystery school. And so this is totally appropriate that we're having this conversation.
The transcendental object at the end of time, I think, is the only box left to check here, Dennis.
We're not talking about that. I'm sorry, you missed the Experiment at La Chorrera event. No,
exactly.
We're not talking about the transcendental object at the end of time. That's just too woo-woo. But thank you for bringing it up. I mean, it does raise, interesting because Christianity is an apocalyptarian religion, and it's based on the idea of a linear time, that history has an end. And then there is a post-historical period, which we don't know what that is. So that was a big influence for both Terence and me at the time. I think we were, on board with the idea that time was something that eventually was going to end. And then whatever happened, of course, in Christianity, it's the last judgment and all of that. But something happens. There's some kind of a singularity, and that may be true, but that's a whole other conversation, Brian. And maybe when we do the Stoned Ape seminar, we can talk about that. But
perfect.
I think this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate your making the time, and I hope we get lots of feedback, and I'm sure we will, and I think most of it will be good. So thank you, Brian. This has been
thank you.
This has been a great interview, and
Dennis, thank you, and for all your efforts and all your work, all these many years. I mean, I mean it when I feel like you were such a huge inspiration to me, going back these 12, 13 years, and I probably wouldn't have gone down the rabbit hole were it not for people like you who were dedicating themselves to the science of these plants and fungi. So you were hugely inspirational to me, And I just want to say thank you to everything you've done, are doing, and everything, that the future holds. I couldn't be more honored to talk to you.
Well, I thank you, Brian. You're the new generation, of scholars, and you really have stepped up to the plate on this. I mean, this is the best piece of scholarship I've seen in many a year about this topic. So it's really an honor to have you on our fireside chat. And for now, you're off the hook. So you could go to the beach. And
Finally.
Okay.